Orlando is a 1992 striking period drama fantasy film with a postmodern twist, starring Tilda Swinton as the time-travelling titular character. Loosely based on Virginia Woolf's 1928 novel Orlando, a Biography, the film was written and directed by Sally Potter and received arguably divided critical praise and admiration for its visual treatment of the novel. Featuring gorgeous visuals, the film, particularly its maze scene, served as the primary inspiration for the 2020 spring exhibition of the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was postponed until October of 2020, and the Met Gala, which was cancelled due to COVID. Due to time constraints in both video length and the time I had to make this video will mostly concentrate and explore the themes in context to the film and not the novel. Although longer, the video also turned out to be shallower than I would have liked, so apologies in advance. Also, if I talk in absolutes, this doesn't mean you have to take everything said as objective fact. Often described as not your typical costume drama, the $6 million budget film and the novel distinctly divides Orlando's journey into two sections. The first of which Orlando retains his male body, and the second dealing with his awakening in a woman's body. The physical transition, or metamorphosis if you will, leads Orlando to question themes of their gender, sexuality, and identity. For context, the novel's subtitle, A Biography, is particularly revealing as an indication that Orlando was a fictional representation of, love letter and tribute to, Woolf's friend and lover, Vita Sackville West. The pair were also members of the Bloomsbury group, or the Bloomsbury set. The Bloomsbury group was another one of those elite literary circles, much like Stratford-on-Odeon or the Inklings, that came together, according to Penguin, every Thursday for food and drinks at Vanessa Bell's home, which served as a clubhouse in London's then bohemian Bloomsbury. As these bohemian writers and artists openly questioned and resisted traditional norms of gender and sexuality, it has been presumed that Orlando's smooth transition from man to woman reflects the couple's own understanding of gender and sexuality. And Orlando reflects this through their presentation of gender. Orlando's possession of both the qualities of a man and woman and having affairs with both ultimately disrupts popular gender stereotypes. Orlando was also inspired by Woolf's reverence for and intrigue in Vita's aristocratic genealogy, and the subsequent sexual freedoms it afforded to Vita. Orlando's physical transition is therefore the most pivotal event, establishing the film and book's narrative turning point. Further, Orlando's turmoil appears to arise from the challenge in distinguishing their true authentic self from the pressures of societal influence. Aside from this male-female division in Orlando's structure, the film is segmented into a sequence of intertitles: 1600 Death, 1610 Love, 1650 Poetry, 1700 Politics, 1800 Sex, and The Undated Birth, set in early 90s London. Consequently, the audience follows Orlando as he/she traverses through a journey of time. In a sense, as per Julianne Piddock, very little happens in the film, as its events can be condensed into this string of intertitles, or a string of single terms. So it isn't about what happens, but the meaningfulness and richness of Potter's Orlando is conveyed through a microeconomy of polite silences, gestures, and looks. And each movement is distinguished in its own colorations and mood, from the iterations of eye color to the costumes. Orlando's centuries-long existence, experiencing various epochs and personas, contributes to the eventual evolving understanding of self. The film begins in the Elizabethan era, with Orlando sitting beneath an oak tree which crowns the hill of his father's mansion, unable to write poetry. The opening sequence, curiously like many films I've covered, takes place at the same location as the closing sequence. Where this story begins is where this story ends, though with one essential difference. Orlando is now a woman, wife, and mother. With the oak tree being both the opening and closing shot, we have to wonder if this tree has any wider symbolic meaning. Indeed, if we turn to the novel, there is a grander significance to be found in the motif of the oak tree, which appears as both an actual living tree and a poem titled The Oak Tree, apparently a veiled version of Vita's The Land, which Orlando wrote for centuries in the novel. In the book, the poem is representative of and central to Orlando's identity as a poet and later her growth as a writer and person. Throughout Orlando's long life, she revises and continues to rewrite The Oak Tree, which transforms from a gloomy poem to one that is sprightly and satirical. As such, the poem and Orlando's own transformation parallel each other in the book. Although, throughout all these changes, Orlando remains fundamentally the same, still a poet, positioning the oak tree as a constant reassuring appearance and presence. One thing that's interesting to note in the novel is Woolf's personification of the oak tree, describing it in terms of the human body. Using descriptors such as spine, ribs, and bones, the tree is depicted akin to a human being, which embraces the return of their son or daughter, Orlando, returning as a confident, self-possessed woman, having finally fulfilled her aspirations to the stability, firmness, and assurance that is offered by the oak. This echoes what was previously said: the oak tree is Orlando's sanctuary, his or her safe haven, weathering the tumult of Orlando's feelings, protecting his naked soul, and allowing him or her to find peace for himself. And due to the oak tree poem, Orlando finally gains the recognition she desires, and thus decides to lay the poem to rest under the physical oak tree as a sort of gift. The plot of the novel comes full circle, with the poem meeting its living prototype. This is in contrast to Potter's Orlando, where Orlando gives up poetry when she transitions into a woman. Though for both the film and novel, trees themselves are an apt symbol, for Orlando grapples with immortality by embracing the fluidity of time and identity. Trees cannot die, instead renewing themselves eternally. Hence, trees in general, aside from what the oak tree can already signify, such as strength, sturdiness, and reassurance, can further connote recurring regeneration and immortality.
Do not fade.
We then get the first witty aside, a stylistic device where Orlando directly addresses the audience through the camera.
Very interesting person.
A man must follow his heart. Terrific play. The treachery of women.
10 times before his gender transition, breaking the fourth wall.
That is, I.
Orlando's interruption of the voiceover establishes his authority and expresses his self-awareness, reaching outside of the diegetic action to create a moment of complicity with the audience. It can suggest Orlando taking ownership of their own story by breaking the narrative flow, or a realization and reminder that we, the audience, are viewing a film, a construction itself, which invites our own individual interpretation, subsequently echoing the overarching theme of which gender and identity are constructed in Woolf's novel. The asides also create a recognition of pattern, or of familiarity, as they typically occur at the end of scenes, which lends itself well to one of the film's more iconic lines.
Same person. No difference at all.
Kate Belmore also touches on Potter's inclusion of the audience, echoing the sentiment that the asides establish a consistent, loyal relationship with the audience, which Orlando does not have with any character in the film. This personal and intimate connection allows the audience to feel as though they're present and a part of Orlando's journey as though we know him. Belmore goes further. Aside from commenting on the unconventional use of asides, she explores the link between scopophilia and cinema, and the film's camera work. Scopophilia, simply put, being the pleasure gained in looking or being looked at. Because of these asides, as spotlighted by Belmore, not only does the audience look at Orlando, but more importantly, Orlando looks at us. This brings us back to these asides shining light on Orlando's awareness, specifically his awareness of the audience. In terms of the camera work, instead of excessive cuts or disruption to vital scenes, Potter uses panning and tracking camera movements to increase the duration of the shots. Belmore explains that these camera techniques support the strong bond which has been established by the asides, further intensifying the audience's emotional investment in Orlando. An example of this is later when the female Orlando drinks tea with American adventurer Shelmerdine, played by Billy Zane. As the conversation gets deeper on the topic of liberty and freedom of gender expectations, traditional back and forth cuts between the couple cease, and Potter employs a single shot that sways to and fro from the characters. Awakening from his accidental slumber, Orlando rushes to meet Queen Elizabeth I. As she arrives at his father's sprawling stately home via the longboat of a ceremonial flotilla. Portrayed by Quentin Crisp, Elizabeth's appearance is fleeting but nothing short of visually spectacular. According to Sally Potter, she had worked out a colour palette for each sequence which came from Virginia Woolf. She explains that there's a paragraph in the book talking about golds and reds of the Elizabethan period. Hence, rich, warm tones, fit for a queen, reign supreme during the Elizabethan reign. Orlando, a handsome young boy, a trait which his father intends to capitalise on,
all that is mine is here for your pleasure,
is then made to serve as a poet and a page at the Elizabethan court. During a banquet given in Elizabeth's honour, Orlando recites a poem, but compares the aging queen to a dying rose,
and falls away.
This offends the monarch, who stops him mid-performance, though Orlando's blunder doesn't put off the elderly queen's affections, who remains taken with him. After Orlando accompanies the queen on a garden walk, Elizabeth fixes a garter to Orlando's leg, and adopts him as her
Favorite.
After Elizabeth is undressed by her ladies-in-waiting, Orlando is summoned to pay a visit to the queen's bedchamber. Whilst Woolf does not explain Orlando's immortality, the queen generously bequeaths Orlando a home, but on one condition.
Do not fade. Do not wither. Do not grow old.
And so he does not. It is therefore heavily implied that Elizabeth on her deathbed confers immortality upon Orlando, willing away the effects of time. Perhaps there is nothing more terrible to the dying queen than the decay of blooming youth. Or maybe the Virgin Queen thrusts upon him the gift of immortality to ensure the preservation of her own existence, by living vicariously through Orlando as a pseudo-heir or successor. Elizabeth dies, but Orlando lives on. The gender reversals of Orlando and Elizabeth being played by actors of the opposite sex adds dimension and irony to Potter's exploration of the fluidity, mutability, and constructedness of gender. The irony is apparent from the opening, where the voiceover expresses that
There can be no doubt about his sex.
after her death, Orlando gives us another aside. He calls the late queen a
Very interesting person.
which allows Orlando to undermine the queen's authority and control, as it is Orlando that determines our response to her and by extension how we perceive the film. It's the Jacobean era. King James I has been installed on the throne, and the coffin of Orlando's father trails behind him, making Orlando the master of his late father's wealthy estate. Whilst the encounter with Elizabeth leaves Orlando ageless, thanks to the mysterious slumbers that befall Orlando and leave his appearance untouched by the passage of time, Orlando finds longevity and the Queen's request to be less freeing and more trapping. As Caroline Bainbridge puts it, Orlando's struggle to write poetry at the beginning of the film suggests that he is unable to articulate his position within the symbolic realm. His actions and responses are structured by those around him, notably his father and the Queen. As such, Orlando, unable to break out of convention, does what he thinks needs to be done, finding himself in a lukewarm engagement with a noblewoman by the name of Lady Euphrosyne. As the intertitle would suggest, this is to be a recipe for disaster. Orlando and Euphrosyne, his now fiancée, gaze at a painting of Orlando's parents, before turning towards the camera. The complexities of assigning a fixed gender are briefly explored satirically through this shot. As the portrait looms over the pair, we see Orlando standing in front and in place of his mother, illustrating either that he steps into a feminine and maternal role, or he doesn't feel quite at home in his masculinity. Euphrosyne assumes the role of his father, thus visually echoing the gender ambiguity and confusion which is central to the narrative. In this second movement, titled Love, ruled by an all-or-nothing thinking and an apt black and white colour scheme, King James appears to have taken a liking to Orlando. This time he appears with James's court as they receive the Russian ambassadorial envoy with pomp and circumstance. a grand feast in an even grander tent on the ice. Clothing is another recurrent motif essential to Potter's Orlando. It can be symbolic of the artificiality of gender and comment on gender as a social construction. This is because clothing in Orlando aids in obscuring the character's true gender identity. As we'll see later, Orlando's gender identity as both a man and woman is communicated and represented through their clothing. When Orlando wears male garb, he is perceived as a man, and when they wear a dress, Orlando is perceived by others as a woman. It is suggested, therefore, that it is Orlando's clothes, not their body, which ultimately dictates the gender of Orlando. The way we dress can depict the way we are perceived by others. Other characters find themselves pigeonholed into specific gender identities based on their clothes. As England faces the so-called Great Frost, which has frozen the Thames, something within the entourage of the Russian embassy catches the attention of Orlando's eyes. A figure skates on ice, and it's elucidated in the novel that Orlando is almost certain from their form and clothes that the she must be a man. Obviously this is no man, and the frame reveals the skater to be a Russian princess and the daughter of the Muscovy ambassador. During the feast, the princess reveals her pet name to be Sash, and the two connect over mutually spoken French.
Mais la plupart des Anglais ne veut pas qu'avec les étrangers.
Despite his betrothal and their difference in background, Orlando is instantly besotted with the exotic and androgynous free spirit, who skates literal circles around him. This captivation doesn't go unnoticed by both Euphrosyne and the court.
His absurd affection will not last the season. She's a foreigner.
They try to dissuade him from pursuing the object of his affections, but Orlando humiliates his fiancée by doing so publicly. Hence, the intertitles act as shorthand for the significant action of each movement. Queen Elizabeth's death in the first chapter and Orlando's love for Sasha here. Subsequently, Orlando is confronted by Euphrosyne, but shows little care.
Would never have worked.
Orlando then introduces Sasha to his home where he intends to live with her.
By yourself at the moment.
But whilst Orlando is madly in love with her, he is blind to the superficial attachment and unreciprocated affection from Sasha. Helena Young suggests that aside from their romantic inequality, this could also signify a disparity between their cultural ideologies. Sasha's declaration that
because when the ice breaks we must go
signals her desire for liberty and self-government, which opposes Orlando's insistence that
Because I can't bear this happiness to end.
So while Sasha's statement emphasizes that she seizes opportunities for liberty, Orlando implies in contrast a resignation to the eventual end of happiness, because Orlando, unlike Sasha, organizes his life around external constraints. The extent of Sasha's shallow affections are revealed when Orlando catches Sasha in the arms of a sailor. He grows jealous confronting her, but is pretty much gaslighted by Sasha into gaslighting himself.
Shadows, you saw shadows, you were in his arms, it was illusion in light.
I suppose when you're in love you only see what you want to see. Orlando instructs her to meet him at midnight at London Bridge. Before executing their plans to elope, Orlando stops to watch a performance of Shakespeare's Othello. According to Catherine Craft-Fairchild, homoerotic threads are picked up again in Potter's restaging of Desdemona's death from Othello, which underscores the sexual triangulation previously presented while it emphasizes Orlando's deep jealousy and possessiveness of Sasha. When the man playing Othello passionately embraces the younger man playing Desdemona, the man-to-man woman, as in the man on the stage that plays a woman, eroticism echoes the previous woman-to-woman man, as in Tilda Swinton's portrayal of a man, seduction of Sasha, in ways that suggest the polymorphous pleasures available to an earlier age. Aside from this, the introduction of a theatrical stage spotlights to us that the world of Orlando, the film, is literally staged. The visuals of the film feel vaguely familiar, but the artificial staging and design are exaggerated to such extremes that they leave the film feeling otherworldly, fantastical, or of unreality. We can therefore be reminded of the themes concerning constructedness and artificiality. Orlando waits for Sasha at the bridge, but just as the chance of the Great Frost, which froze in the Muscovy ship, brought them together, chance of rain breaks up the ice, allowing the ship to set sail, and in turn allows Sasha to abandon him.
Don't ever go.
Because when the ice breaks, we must go.
Sasha's jilting of Orlando causes another one of his asides,
The treachery of women.
which, when compared to his direct addresses as a woman, portray Orlando in a favourable light as lover, poet and patron.
A man must follow his heart. Terrific play. The treachery of women. Ah, poetry.
There's also doubling and irony to be seen in Potter's Orlando, particularly in this line,
Treachery of women.
which was reflected in Euphrosyne's earlier line.
The treachery of men.
Firstly, it's ironic that when Euphrosyne's affections are scorned by Orlando, he downplays the scenario,
It would never have worked.
yet resorts to the same reasoning when jilted by Sasha. Euphrosyne's slight may also subtly foreshadow Orlando's transformation into a woman, where this statement,
The treachery of men.
will no longer apply. Heartbroken from Sasha's betrayal, Orlando falls into a deep slumber before awakening. It's 1650 and Orlando has set his sights on poetic purpose as opposed to love. As such, this period sees a surge of interest from Orlando in composing sonnets and verses. Orlando invites a greedy poet, Nick Green, to his home, hoping to befriend and share his poetry aspirations. As they dine together, Green explains that the sacred subject of poetry is
Dead in England.
However, he implies that he can dedicate himself to fine writing for a generous sum of
£300 a year, paid quarterly.
For time is money.
he tells Orlando, suggesting he will only validate his poetry on that condition. Orlando agrees to pay the pension, only to have his poetry mocked and scrutinised by Green. Played by Heathcote Williams, the essence of Green's role to reflect a resistance to new literary forms and Woolf's critique of literary criticism are translated from the novel, albeit differently. In the novel, Green has harsh criticisms for Orlando's play, only to insist in a later century that Orlando's poem must be published. This is mirrored in Green's film portrayal, where Heathcote Williams shows up as a publisher in the 20th century to again hypocritically insist that Orlando's writing must be published. Having been ridiculed, Orlando takes up an ambassadorial appointment in Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. There, Orlando meets the Emperor, the Khan, who asks for the British Empire's aid in war against enemies as they drink
To the manly virtues. Loyalty, courage.
After a friendship blossoms between Orlando and the Khan, Orlando abandons his European dress for Turkish styles. Later, Orlando is informed by Archduke Harry that he has been promoted by Queen Anne for
ambassadorial services rendered to the crown.
During his celebratory dinner, the Emperor arrives late to tell Orlando that enemies are now at the city gates. He asks if Orlando will help honouring their friendship, which Orlando agrees to. Although during this sequence, it's clear that Orlando wants no part of violent war, falling into unconsciousness. So, in many ways, Orlando has none of the manly virtues, despite his drinking with the Khan to loyalty and courage. Hence, the next scene can be interpreted as Orlando failing the trials of manliness. Orlando does not get the girl, he proves himself to be a mediocre poet and fails to fight in war. As such, as Sally Potter implies in interviews, Orlando's transition into a woman occurs because, in war, Orlando faces the ultimate test every boy grows up holding somewhere in his psyche, that he may have to go to war, fight, kill, or be killed. This is the moment Orlando realizes he cannot, will not be a man in the sense that he is being asked to. Orlando awakes from an inexplicable slumber, taking off his wig and leaving his clothing, only to find that he has transformed into a she. This metamorphosis leaves Orlando completely nude, blissfully laid bare. Young suggests it is in Orlando's nakedness that we find purity of access to Orlando's identity. unadulterated by the accessories and objects that may have previously cloaked the truth, especially as the importance of clothing is rather significant to the shaping of identity in the film. Young goes on further to talk about how the scene is absent in the significant features typically found in film, such as furniture, props, and costumes, and how the lack of these external elements emphasizes the naturality and simplicity of the scene, allowing Orlando's identity to shine through without any distractions. Then Orlando splashes water on herself, reminiscent of a religious baptism, which may symbolize her transformation and introduction into the feminine world. The novel treats the transformation differently. In Woolf's version, 3 muses, Lady of Purity, Chastity, and Modesty, symbolic of feminine virtues, appear and dance around the body of Orlando. Comparatively, Potter's version is tonally sacred, ritualistic, and ethereal. The camera pans slowly over Orlando's body, emphasizing her beauty, complete with the whispering chants and soft lighting illuminating dust particles. This eroticization of Orlando's body can be perceived as transforming the female body into a fetish. Orlando sees her fully female self in the mirror for the first time. In John Berger's Ways of Seeing, he posits that a mirror functions to make the woman connive in treating herself as first and foremost a sight. Mirrors are typically associated with self-reflection or self-awareness, but Craft-Fairchild asserts that in this case, seeing herself in the mirror doesn't empower Orlando or provide her with agency. Instead, it is symbolic of her exclusion from societal norms and expectations surrounding femininity, which often dictate that women are primarily objects of visual pleasure rather than active agents in their own lives. Amongst other scholars, Sophie Meyer has pointed out that Orlando's pose appears to refer to the aesthetics and critique the gender politics of Botticelli's The Birth of Venus. In another aside, those direct addresses to the camera, Orlando declares that she is the
Same person, no difference at all.
In this section, I want to use Catherine Craft-Fairchild's essay with the title based on this line,
Same person, just a different sex.
to explore Orlando's change in sex more deeply. According to Craft-Fairchild, Potter insists repeatedly in interviews that her film is about an essential self that transcends gender. According to Potter, she believes that Woolf's hypothesis is that we're all born simply human beings who are then shaped one way or the other, masculine or feminine, and that it's mostly how we're perceived by others that makes the difference, rather than what we are. She insisted further that Orlando is a look at the blurring of sexual identity and the nonsense of femininity and masculinity as construction. It's about the claiming of an essential self, an essential human self that transcends gender. Potter sums this up again for Sight and Sound, saying, "For me, Orlando is not so much about femininity and difference as about Woolf's notion of an essential self that lies beyond gender." It seems Craft-Fairchild takes issue with Potter's insistence that Woolf's text and her film end up blurring these lines of gender or sexual identity, as in gender distinctions are completely erased in Woolf's Orlando, and therefore that's what her film sets out to do. Craft-Fairchild claims this is premature and inaccurate, disagreeing with Potter's notion that Woolf reduces the masculine and feminine to being the same or meaningless. Her position is that just because Woolf explores identity beyond gender, time and place, it doesn't mean these factors become irrelevant. This is supported by arguments from Christy Burns and Susan Watkins, contending that Woolf's text presents an ongoing tension between personal autonomy and ideological forces, as opposed to illustrating the existence of an essential self standing apart from history. It's a question of whether an innate human essence can transcend historical effects, or if an individual's personality is fully shaped by the world around them. Burns' argument is that Woolf's portrayal of Orlando's identity allows for both personal agency and external influences to shape identity within the context of historical change and sexuality, which means that whilst Woolf's text acknowledges the possibility for individuals to participate in shaping their own identities within society, it also recognises the influence of historical and societal factors in this process. In essence, Craft-Fairchild, Burns and Watkins are arguing that Woolf's exploration of gender in Orlando is much more complex than simply erasing or trivializing gender distinctions, but by representing historical periods accurately in the film depicting how gender identity began to develop in the 18th century and became more solidified in the 19th century, Potter's Orlando does what it claims to not. Orlando, the film, actually reinforces constructions of gender rather than breaking them down. The next scene emphasizes Craft-Fairchild's point. Following Orlando's transformation, we see her traveling across the desert atop a camel. The camera zooms out to a high angle, rendering Orlando to a small speck on the screen. The high camera angles of female Orlando, which force us to literally look down on her, are contrasted against the frequent low shot angles of male Orlando. And so, as Craft-Fairchild puts it, this is a rather obvious diminishment of the character who had so fully occupied the frame when male, and suggests that Orlando's recent assertion that there is
no difference at all
between male and female is untrue. Hence, the sex change appears the pivotal point within the film, an explicit construction of gender that alters completely the treatment of Potter's protagonist. A far cry from Potter's insistence that her film blurs the lines of sexual identity. Though Craft-Fairchild appears to disagree with Potter's claims of an essential self and contends that gender ideology unavoidably permeates the film, by precisely highlighting the historical constructedness of gender, her essay appears to suggest that she views the film's engagement with the historical and cultural construction of gender identity as more useful and compelling than what Potter claims it to be. So, to sum up, Potter's idea of an essential self suggests that there is a core identity within individuals that exists independently of social constructs or external influences. It implies people have a fixed and innate sense of self which remains unchanged despite societal norms or historical contexts. For example, if we take the topic of women's clothing choices, an essential self might lead someone to think that there are innate preferences or inclinations towards certain types of clothing, regardless of societal expectations or norms. Someone that believes in an essential self might argue that a woman naturally feels more comfortable in wearing skirts or dresses, because this is an expression of her true essence. And women that prefer wearing trousers or pants may somehow be deviating from her true self or suppressing her innate femininity. Therefore, critics argue that this idea of an essential self is potentially reinforcing traditional gender expectations, as opposed to allowing the possibility to challenge or reconfigure them. On the other hand, we have critics like Craft-Fairchild who argue that Potter's film firstly does the opposite by emphasizing the constructed nature of gender roles, and by highlighting how these roles are socially created and influenced by external factors such as historical changes and societal norms. Craft-Fairchild implies that there is no singular essential self unaffected by these external forces. In context to clothing choices, she might argue that they are often influenced by gender norms and expectations, and so associations with certain styles and colours with the masculine or feminine are socially constructed rather than inherent preferences. So for example, this whole idea of blue for boys and pink for girls. And her argument of pointing out constructions opens up possibilities for negotiation and allows for reconfiguration of constructed gender roles. This emphasis on the constructed nature of gender aligns with contemporary gender theory, particularly the ideas of Judith Butler, who argues that gender is performative and constantly constructed through social practices. I'll touch more on the clothing later, but an example of this constructedness is that in the Elizabethan era, the male Orlando can be seen wearing vibrant yellow tights underneath his hose. In the 20th century, the era in which the film ends, the tights would be considered a female garment. And conversely, the 20th century female Orlando sports trousers, which would have clashed with the societal norms Orlando has lived through. Another aspect which spotlights the diminishment of Orlando's authority are the asides, which, aside from this scene and maybe the direct addresses during the maze sequence, the female Orlando's asides are mute looks as opposed to the male Orlando's spoken addresses. Especially as the female Orlando begins to understand society's newfound expectations of her to be obedient like a doll or some other object. Although another interpretation of the decreasing asides, which is more aligned with Potter's insistence that her film blurs the lines of sexual identity, is that Orlando's asides decrease because her story is that of someone finding their true identity, or as Potter describes, an essential self. A deeper sense of identity which remains constant, consistent, and unchanged despite changes in circumstances and roles. And as Orlando discovers her core identity and becomes more assured of herself, it is appropriate for some that these asides or questioning looks to the audience would decrease. This brings us back to the topic of clothing. Lady Orlando has returned to England, where servants dress the female Orlando. At this point, female Orlando's garb is much lighter, feminine, and pastel than the previous darker shades for the male Orlando's wardrobe. Though the Elizabethan and Jacobean sequences featured darker colours, it doesn't necessarily indicate a stark contrast between masculinity and femininity or strict determination of gender if we take those periods in isolation. The Elizabethan era is characterised by a somewhat notable acceptance of gender fluidity. It wasn't until the Victorian era did a very rigid gender norm become firmly established. Whilst differences in male and female dress during the Elizabethan era existed, they were not as distinct as they would later become, which is why I mentioned the implications of taking these earlier periods in isolation. As while it may to some extent expose the differences between masculinity and femininity, it is the comparison of earlier periods with the mid-18th century which informs the idea of light versus dark, revealing a shift in the way that femininity and masculinity was viewed. Male clothing in the Elizabethan era was ornate, sometimes even more so than women's, but by the time of George III, male dress became more severe with ornamentation largely reserved for women. Thomas Laqueur discusses the introduction of the two-sex model, which was basically how around the middle of the 18th century, so the current period in which we find female Orlando, there was a shift in thinking about human sexuality. The previous held belief of a one-sex model where the female body was seen as incomplete or imperfect versions of men actually allowed for more gender fluidity because there wasn't a strict binary division between male and female attributes in its single unified model of the human body. Men and women were not viewed as having entirely separate attributes, but as bodies along a continuum of metaphysical perfection. Laqueur argued that this shift marked the invention of sex as we understand it today. Previously, distinctions between male and female were less rigid, but with the emergence of the two-sex model, there was radical dimorphism which emphasized biological differences. However, Laqueur describes the two-sex system as lacking stability, because in contrast to the previous model, it represents a significant departure in how societies conceptualized gender and sexuality. Subsequently, strict laws attempted to stabilize gender identities through clothing and appearance. This meant that visible markers such as clothing were used to signify both class and gender status. However, these distinctions were not as clear-cut as they would become in later centuries. But as the narrative progresses to contemporary 90s London, we are greeted with a resurgence of fluidity in gender boundaries. Therefore, there is a notable shift in the way Orlando is perceived compared to prior periods because of this shift in perception. And this is reflected in this scene where female Orlando is being dressed. Compared to the previous scene where the male Orlando fidgets in agitation, female Orlando submits herself to her servants. Orlando is tight-laced, bound, and confined by a stiff dress. The submission, constraint, restrictiveness, and discomfort, further illustrated by Orlando's hair piled on her head, emphasizes the regulation and oppression Orlando will be subjected to despite her assertion that she's the
same person, just a different sex.
So whilst Orlando's male status did afford him particular freedoms depicted here, we should also take into account the historical shifts from the Elizabethan era to the mid-18th century in attitudes towards gender. So as women's roles became increasingly confined, clothing conventions increasingly tightened. Orlando trudges through rooms in her ostentatious gown, hindering her movement. First through a room where furniture is covered in white sheets, and secondly to sit on a couch. The first ivory dress almost mirrors the veiled furniture. Daniel Wolber aptly expresses that in this outfit she floats like a ghost. As if trapped by expectations of femininity, she's been made into an object within her own home. Once she was a red flame on green gardens, black velvet on snow, a man of contrast. Now background and character are becoming a material unity. The intentional exaggeration and over-elaboration of her two costumes to an absurd extreme highlights the historical construction of gender and femininity in the 18th century, and how Orlando is not only trapped in a symbolic prison, but the performity and pageantry now associated with being a woman. As the expectations of gender for both men and women are merely artificial, socially constructed, and entirely man-made. The excessiveness of her clothing also allows her to blend in with characters of gender ambiguity like Queen Elizabeth, but stand out against the characters fitting the mold of more traditional gender roles. Aside from changes to her clothing, Orlando's peers transition from influential male figures from royalty, military, and literature to women in lowly positions, such as servants, possibly signalling Orlando's entry into a traditionally feminine space. Orlando enters the literary salon, adjusting to the charade of femininity and submitting to the gaze of men. Wolber describes material unity between the background and character as even more evident in this scene as the entertaining company people and decor merge in a flowery mess of pastels. Many shots of the female Orlando are full-figured establishing shots and medium shots compared to numerous close-ups of male Orlando which dominate the frame. The primary mode of shooting the male Orlando, the close-ups, emphasize the importance of his words and thoughts, whilst diminishing the significance of his clothing. The opposite is true of Orlando now. Trapped in femininity, her self-expression is not the focus, but her looks and body are. Orlando sits opposite the male poets like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift to challenge their patronizing remarks on women. Orlando is immobilized on her seat. Compared to the scenes of the male Orlando, which are characterized by action and movement, such as running to meet Queen Elizabeth or skating on ice with Sasha, the pacing of the female Orlando is much more static and inactive. Orlando sits and loiters instead. It isn't until later in the 20th century where Orlando is seen running from world wars and riding on motorcycles, in line with what was previously said about the fluidity of gender in relation to historical context. The men begin defining what constitutes proper feminine behaviour.
We should be adorned in furs and feathers.
Apart from my wife, of course.
Will insist upon attempting to learn Greek.
As Orlando has lived as both man and now woman, she is able to recognise their male chauvinism, hypocrisy, and misogyny. What it means to be a woman is all the things Orlando is not expected to be or do as a man. This barely has any effect, and the continued insults on her intelligence are enough to make her leave. The Archduke Harry, also present at the salon, pursues Orlando when lawyers intrude to tell the lady that they have come to seize her estate because her femininity amounts to her being legally dead. Harry, who has always seemed besotted with Orlando, takes the opportunity now that Orlando has no right to own her own property. Archduke Harry proposes to the female Orlando, and when she refuses to accept, Harry tells her,
I am England, and you are mine.
And when she asks him,
On what grounds?
he tells her
That I adore you.
These words feel familiar because they've been said before, by Orlando.
You're mine. Why? Because I adore you.
Satirically, Orlando's previous claim that Sasha was his because he adores her is now echoed by Archduke Harry. And so the absurdity of masculine claims on the feminine is doubly exposed. Orlando's previous words for Sasha,
The treachery of women,
is now applicable to herself. When Orlando holds firm on her refusal, Harry asks her,
Who else would have you?
on account of her ambiguous sexuality, threatening that she will
Die a spinster.
To escape these prophecies and perhaps liberate herself from the confines of traditional femininity, Orlando panics and angrily spits out,
spinster, alone.
before jilting Harry and disappearing into the hedge maze. time bends in the labyrinthine shrubbery, transitioning seamlessly from the powdery pastels of the 18th century to the darker purples, browns, navies, greens and blacks of the industrial Victorian era. Thus, at its most basic level, the maze acts as a narrative device which drives forward the timeline. However, on a metaphorical level, the course of the winding maze with its dead ends, which can reflect societal barriers and expectations of gender, may mark the beginning of Orlando's quest to shape her own gender identity by resisting the aspects of femininity that confine her to a fate she desperately rejects. Gender roles and norms may feel convoluted and restrictive, especially for those who do not conform to traditional binary categories. Consequently, Orlando can be perceived as symbolically breaking free from constraints as she transcends the maze. Orlando's venture into the narrow maze can further be interpreted as a visual representation of her state of mind, or the sense of turmoil and confusion caused by the change in sex and the ramifications this has had on her life and sense of self, or her self-discovery and navigation of the complexities of this newfound existence as a woman. Aside from a rejection of her constructed identity, Caroline Bainbridge touches on the maze's function as one of the most obvious and most important articulations of space-time or spatio-temporality in the film. The maze sequence may visually connect gender issues with the constructions of space-time by creating a sense of temporal and spatial disorientation. For example, as mentioned previously, time seems to warp and bend as Orlando traverses the maze, emphasizing the subjective nature of the temporal experience. In the maze, the passage of time feels erratic and unpredictable. There are moments where Orlando appears to move quickly, but at others where time stretches endlessly. Similarly, the maze's high edges and twisting pathways restrict space and obscure sightlines, which can make it challenging for Orlando to discern where they are going. This confusion from the maze's contortion blurs the distinctions between the areas of the maze, emphasizing how Orlando feels trapped in the role of woman. Throughout her book, A Female Cinematics, Bainbridge's insights are informed by the works of French philosopher Luce Irigaray, who claims that men and women experience space and time differently due to their different roles and experiences in society and history. Irigaray contends that men are seen as already formed or established in a state of being, while women are perceived as still developing or evolving in a state of becoming, partly because men have been historically separated from the nurturing role of mother, while women have been traditionally associated with this nurturing role. To elaborate, because men have typically held and occupied positions of power and authority in society, and women relegated to subordinate roles as caretakers and nurturers, according to Irigaray, women are therefore viewed in a state of becoming, constantly evolving and defined by their roles in relation to others rather than as independent entities with their own identities and experiences. This means that because women are often seen as in a supporting role to men rather than individuals in their own right, this can affect their sense of identity and lead to a struggle in finding their own sense of self and subjectivity because their experiences of time and space are not recognized or valued in the same way as men's. This is felt in Orlando's experiences where societal expectations and treatment changes based on his/her gender presentation. As a man, Orlando enjoys certain privileges and freedoms denied to women of the same time period, reflecting Irigaray's ideas that men and women experience space and time differently due to assigned roles and societal expectations. This emergence into the 19th century sees Orlando wigless and swapping out the wide panniers and rococo finery for a more modest Victorian bustle. As she takes flight from the maze, we are ushered into the Victorian era, an age of innovation, which saw England transform from an agricultural country to an industrial one. Billy Zane's character, Shelmardine, an American adventurer, is thrown from his horse. Their encounter parodies Jane Eyre, with Shelmardine needing help from Orlando. According to Mayer, smoke and mirrors are wittily central to the abrupt shifts of time that take place in the novel and film. For example, the smoke of the steam engine is heralded as the future by Shelmardine. Afterwards, Lady Orlando invites the injured Shelmardine to her home to nurse him. As she tends to him, their conversation becomes more serious, with their dialogue highlighting the fluidity of gender and societal expectations. Firstly, Orlando reflects on the idea of risking one's life for a cause, suggesting that gender might influence such decisions.
If I were a man, I might choose not to risk my life for an uncertain cause.
In saying this, Orlando implies that this act could be perceived as a masculine trait. However, her speculation introduces doubt about whether gender should dictate such actions, because by suggesting that gender might influence one's decisions to risk their life, Orlando challenges the traditional notion that masculinity is inherently linked to courage and self-sacrifice. Shalmerdine responds by suggesting that being a real man involves certain expectations of behaviour and courage.
You might choose not to be a real man at all.
This further complicates and challenges the traditional notions of masculinity, as instead of simply affirming that risking your life is an inherently masculine trait, he suggests that being a real man involves conforming to certain expectations and behaviours. This implies that masculinity is not just about inherent qualities, but more about the fulfilling of societal roles and norms. On the other hand, Shalmerdine muses on the idea of sacrificing your life for family as a woman's role.
Say if I was a woman, I might choose not to sacrifice my life caring for my children.
Orlando then counters by questioning the concept of being
A real woman.
which challenges traditional notions of femininity. Their exchange exposes that their inner feelings and choices may not align with external appearances or societal norms. By acknowledging and questioning these conventions, the pair assert their agency over their identities, subverting the fixed definitions imposed by society. The next morning, after the pair sleep together, Orlando is pronounced female by the British Crown and is informed that she will lose rights to her property unless she gives birth to a son. This reflects real-life obstacles of Sackville West, who was faced with challenges inheriting her family's estate due to laws favouring male lineage over female. Subsequently, Shalmerdine tries to convince Orlando to move to the US. Whilst Orlando never fully satisfies the male virtues as a man, the female Orlando never fulfills the feminine virtues either. Lady Orlando meets her soulmate but forgoes marriage. By refusing to move to the land of liberty and freedom, Orlando lets Shalmerdine go. Just as frost and rain led to and ended Orlando's encounter with Sasha, the change in wind leads to Shalmerdine's departure. We are finally ushered into the final intertitle, Birth, which marks the most radical change from the novel. Instead of ending in 1928, the film ends in contemporary 20th century London, where an editor at a publishing house, portrayed by the same actor who plays Nick Green, praises Orlando's autobiography. In the subsequent scene, she revs up a motorcycle accompanied by a child, a daughter, not a son. Together they visit the great house as tourists. Once more beneath the oak tree, the film concludes with a close-up of Orlando's serene face. Her daughter runs around the field with a camcorder. Instead of feeling the movement of the time, female Orlando sees it instead. As a result, film Orlando becomes both an observer and the observed. This duality is poignantly portrayed in the film's finale, as Orlando's daughter assumes the role of spectator, capturing her mother's essence through the lens of a video camera. Something else to note is that Potter also uses the camera to extend the postmodern nature of Woolf's text, meaning her film doesn't just capture the essence of Woolf's work, but also expands on it by incorporating modern filmmaking techniques and sensibilities. We see that Potter's film maintains its own artistic integrity separate from Woolf's text at the end, in which Potter's child holds a video camera instead of a pen. Instead of a literary figure, the child artist is depicted as a filmmaker. Through this choice, Potter provides meta-commentary on her own film and the filmmaking process as a whole. The shaky and amateurish footage captured from the child's perspective reveals the deliberate artistry and constructed nature of Potter's polished cinematic creation. Orlando sheds a tear which causes her daughter to ask,
"Why are you sad?"
Orlando tells her,
I'm not.
The importance of visuals are reinforced by Orlando's last line. She tells her daughter,
Look up there.
pointing to the recurring appearance of Jimmy Somerville. This time he appears as a golden angel singing, "At last I'm free, neither woman nor man," giving us clues to Orlando's current state of mind. And so what sounded like a recipe for art house obscurity yielded box office gold. When asked what she wanted the audience to feel when they've reached the film's ending, Sally Potter told Walter Donahue, "I hope they feel a sense of hope and empowerment about being alive and the possibility of change, which comes through the word of the song and the expression on Orlando's face. I want people to feel humanly recognized, that their inner landscape of hope and desire and longing has found some kind of expression on screen, a gut feeling of release and relief and hope."